Welcome to Johnny Carson Files. On this video, George Burns sets down his cigar mid-sentence, something the studio audience has never once seen him do in 30 years of television appearances, and reaches into his breast pocket for a small velvet box that nobody, not even Johnny Carson, knew he had brought onto that stage. What is inside that box belonged to Jack Benny, and George Burns has been carrying it, unopened, for exactly 11 years. But before we dive in, quick reminder, double-check that you're subscribed, since a lot of you think you already are and aren't. It's free and it really helps the channel. Thank you for being here. The Tonight Show was recorded that afternoon in early 1985, before a studio audience of roughly 300 people at NBC's Burbank studios. The broadcast set to air to nearly 20 million Americans later that night. George Burns had come on to promote a new film. At 89 years old, still sharp enough to run circles around interviewers a third his age, still smoking the same cigars, still wearing the same kind of perfectly tailored suit that had defined his look since vaudeville. Johnny Carson adored him, genuinely, the way a student adores a teacher who never once made the lessons feel like homework. Johnny leaned back in his chair with the particular ease he reserved for guests who required no management at all. "George," Johnny said, grinning, "you've outlived 3 decades of comedians who used to open for you. What's the secret?" George Burns took a slow pull from his cigar, let the smoke curl upward, and delivered the kind of perfectly timed pause that had made him a legend before most of the audience's parents were born. "Outliving people isn't the trick," George said. "The trick is having someone worth missing when they're gone. That's what keeps you sharp." The audience laughed, assuming it was simply another one of his lines, delivered with his usual deadpan sincerity that made every joke sound like a confession, and every confession sound like a joke. Johnny laughed too, but something in George's eyes did not quite match the laughter in the room. Wait, do not miss this detail, because George Burns was not finished, and what he said next was not a punchline at all. "You know I still talk to him," George said, quieter now, the cigar resting forgotten between his fingers. "Every night. Same time. 20 minutes before bed, the way we used to talk on the phone for 40 years when we were both too old to go out anymore and too stubborn to admit we missed the stage." The studio, which had been comfortably warm with laughter a moment before, cooled into something more attentive, more careful. Johnny Carson leaned forward slightly, sensing, the way he always seemed to sense these things, that the conversation had shifted onto ground that mattered. "Jack," Johnny said softly. George Burns nodded slowly. "Jack Benny. 65 years, I knew that man. 65 years. Johnny and I still reach for the phone some nights before I remember. What you have seen so far is nothing compared to what happened next, because the story behind that reach, and behind the small velvet box George Burns was about to produce from his breast pocket, went back to a winter afternoon in 1974, a modest house in Beverly Hills, and a conversation between 2 old friends that neither of them ever expected would be their last. December of 1974. Jack Benny had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer only weeks earlier, a diagnosis he had shared with almost nobody outside his immediate family, determined, in the same way he had spent his whole career determined to keep a perfectly straight face through any joke at his own expense, not to let the illness become the story of his final months. George Burns and Jack Benny had been inseparable since 1922, when they met as young vaudeville performers, scraping together bookings in small theaters across the East Coast, 2 broke comedians who recognized in each other something rare enough to build a friendship around, a shared understanding that comedy, done honestly, was really just a way of telling the truth without frightening anyone in the process. Their wives, Gracie Allen and Mary Livingston, had become just as close as they had, and for decades the two couples had been nearly inseparable, vacationing together, celebrating holidays together, building a friendship so thoroughly woven into both of their lives that neither man could easily describe where his own sense of humor ended and the other's began. On that December afternoon, George drove to Jack's house in Beverly Hills, as he did most weeks by then, and found his old friend sitting in the study. A blanket over his legs despite the mild California weather, a small stack of unopened mail on the side table that Jack no longer had the energy to sort through himself. They talked for almost 2 hours that day, about nothing important, the way old friends often do when the important things have already been said so many times over so many decades that returning to them feels almost unnecessary. They talked about a booking they'd shared in Providence in 1925 that had nearly ended in disaster when the theater's electricity failed mid-performance, plunging the entire house into total darkness with George mid-routine and no way to signal the wings. Rather than stopping, George had kept talking straight through it, inventing an entirely new bit about the theater itself being too cheap to pay its electric bill, working the audience by sound alone, their laughter in the dark the only feedback he had to work with. Jack, watching from the side of the stage with a lit match cupped in his hand, had laughed so hard he'd had to sit down on an overturned crate, and later told George it was the single funniest 11 minutes he had ever witnessed in his life, timed, he claimed, because he'd been the one holding the pocket watch, unable to see it but counting anyway, out of pure vaudeville habit. They talked about Gracie, gone 18 years by then, and about how George still sometimes caught himself starting a sentence meant for her before remembering. He told Jack that morning that he'd been going through old photographs and had found one from a Christmas party in 1938 where all four of them, George and Gracie, Jack and Mary, were doubled over laughing at something none of them could later remember the cause of. Jack asked to see it. George promised to bring it next week, a promise that would go unfulfilled, though the photograph would eventually make its way to Jack's family regardless, passed along by George after the funeral, with a note of his own attached, 3 lines long, that Jack's daughter kept for the rest of her life without ever showing anyone what it said. They talked about nothing at all, in long stretches too, comfortable silences filling the gaps the way only genuine friendship allows. Two men who had spent 65 years finding they didn't always need words to fill a room the way strangers might have expected from professional comedians. At one point, Jack simply reached over and gripped George's hand for a moment, said nothing, and let go, and George understood, the way he always seemed to understand what Jack meant without Jack needing to spell it out, that the gesture was doing work words weren't quite equipped to do that particular afternoon. Before George left that afternoon, Jack Benny reached into a drawer in the small table beside his chair and pulled out a velvet box, the kind that might hold a piece of jewelry or a small keepsake, and held it out toward George without ceremony, the way he might have handed over a set of car keys. "I want you to have this," Jack said. "Don't open it now. Open it when you actually need to." George, never one to argue with Jack Benny's particular sense of timing, took the box, slipped it into his coat pocket, and did not ask what was inside, trusting, as he always had, that Jack would explain when explaining mattered. Jack Benny passed away 3 weeks later, on December 26, 1974, at his home, surrounded by his family, with George Burns among the very last visitors allowed to see him before the end. George Burns delivered the eulogy at Jack Benny's funeral, a eulogy so raw and unguarded that several attendees later said it was the only time in decades of knowing George Burns that they had seen him fully drop the persona, the timing, the careful construction of every sentence for effect, and simply speak as a man who had lost the other half of something. Jack Benny, George said that day, his voice cracking in a way audiences had genuinely never heard from him, was the best straight man who ever lived, on stage and off it. He made me funnier just by standing next to me. He made everyone funnier just by standing next to them. And now I have to figure out how to be funny standing next to nobody. What George Burns had not told anyone, not his family, not his closest friends, not a single interviewer across the following 11 years, was that Jack had also left him a small handwritten note, folded and tucked beneath the velvet box, with instructions written directly on the outside fold in Jack's own unmistakable handwriting. Open the box when you're ready to laugh about this instead of just being sad about it. That'll take a while, George. Take your time. Back in the Burbank studio, George Burns held the small velvet box in his open palm, turning it slowly. The studio audience now leaning forward as one, sensing that something entirely unplanned was unfolding in front of them. "I've had this in a drawer for 11 years, George said. Never opened it. Told myself I wasn't ready, and then 1 year became 5, and 5 became 11. The way time does when you're afraid of what's on the other side of a decision." Johnny Carson sat perfectly still, his usual quick wit entirely absent, replaced by the particular quiet attentiveness he reserved for moments he recognized as genuinely rare. "George," Johnny said gently, "are you ready now?" George Burns looked at the box for a long moment, then out at the audience, then, finally, directly into the nearest camera, the same unhurried timing he'd used for 70 years of performances, except this time there was no punchline waiting on the other side of the pause. "I think I finally am," George said. His fingers, steadier than anyone might have expected from a man of 89, worked the small clasp open. Inside, resting on a small cushion of velvet, was not jewelry at all, but a single cufflink, gold, slightly worn, engraved with 2 initials intertwined so closely they nearly formed a single mark. GB and JB beneath the cufflink, folded into a small square, was the note Jack had left, which George Burns had also never read, having kept the entire box sealed exactly as Jack handed it to him 11 years earlier. George unfolded the note with trembling hands. The studio audience gasped as one sound, rippling backward through all 300 seats, sensing without yet knowing the contents that they were witnessing something that had waited over a decade to happen. George read the note silently first, his lips moving slightly, and then, his voice breaking completely, read it aloud for the cameras and the 20 million people who would watch that night. "George, if you're reading this, it means you've finally stopped being stubborn, which took you longer than I expected, but I always knew you'd get there eventually, because you always do. This cufflink belonged to the tuxedo I wore the night we opened together in Providence in 1925, the one where the lights went out and you kept the whole audience laughing in the dark for 11 straight minutes until the electricians got things running again. I've had the matching one on my nightstand for 50 years, so I'd see it every morning and remember that night. Remember you. Remember that the best thing that ever happened to my career walked into a booking office in 1922 wearing a suit 2 sizes too big and made me laugh before he'd said a single word. I'm giving you mine now, so you have both. Wear them. Or don't. Just don't forget the 11 minutes in the dark, because that's when I knew, George. That's when I knew you were going to be my best friend for the rest of my life. And I was right. Thank you for that, Jack." The studio held its breath. Nobody applauded right away, because what had happened was too large, too tender, for the usual sounds a television audience makes in response to anything. Ed McMahon had his hand pressed over his eyes. Johnny Carson sat with tears openly on his face, making no attempt to hide them, his composure entirely set aside. George Burns closed his hand gently around the cufflink, holding it the way a much younger man might hold something infinitely fragile. 11 minutes in the dark, George said quietly, mostly to himself, though the microphones caught every word. I'd almost forgotten he counted them. Johnny Carson leaned forward. George, that's one of the most beautiful things I think I've ever heard on this stage. George Burns looked up, his eyes wet but something like his old humor returning at the edges of his expression, the way it always eventually did, no matter how heavy the moment. Jack always did have better timing than me, George said. 11 years, and he still gets the last word. The audience laughed through their tears, a sound that seemed to release something that had been building in the studio for the entire exchange. 300 people needing somewhere to put the emotion that had accumulated across those last several minutes. If a story like this moves you even a little, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who need them. And I want to ask you something specific. Think of a friendship in your own life that has lasted decades, the kind where time somehow makes it stronger instead of wearing it down, and drop just their first name in the comments below so we can see how many of us are lucky enough to have a friendship like that. Ed McMahon, recovering his voice at last, leaned toward the desk microphone and said quietly that in all his years on that stage, he had never once seen George Burns without something clever ready to say, and that watching him sit there with nothing but the truth had taught him more about the two of them than 30 years of interviews combined. Johnny Carson nodded slowly in agreement, glancing once more at George, who was turning the cufflink over between his fingers as though still slightly amazed to be holding it at all. The Tonight Show ran 8 minutes over its scheduled time that evening, and NBC's switchboard stayed lit well past midnight, calls coming in from people who had their own version of an unopened box somewhere in a drawer, something given to them by someone they'd lost, something they had never quite found the courage to open. Letters arrived at NBC for weeks afterward, many of them describing similar objects finally opened after that broadcast aired, similar notes finally read, after years of being too afraid to face them. One letter, which a staff member later read aloud during an internal meeting because it had moved half the office to tears, came from a widower in Ohio who wrote that he had kept his late wife's final voicemail unheard for 6 years, terrified of what hearing her voice again might do to him, and that watching George Burns open that velvet box on television had been the thing that finally gave him permission to press play. George Burns wore that cufflink, paired with its twin from his own collection, at every public appearance for the remaining 12 years of his life, a small detail that observant fans and colleagues noticed, but that George himself never publicly explained again after that single broadcast, as though he had said everything that needed saying in those few minutes and felt no need to revisit it. His longtime assistant later said that George would sometimes touch the cufflink absent-mindedly during interviews, a small habitual gesture nobody but her ever seemed to notice, always during moments when a question veered close to Jack's name. Colleagues who worked with George in those final years said something had genuinely shifted in him after that broadcast. Not a dramatic change, nothing anyone could point to directly, but a kind of settledness that had not quite been there before. He still smoked the same cigars. He still delivered the same impeccably timed jokes. But friends said he seemed, for the first time since 1974, to have stopped waiting for something, as though the act of finally opening that box had closed a door he had been standing in front of for over a decade without fully realizing it. When George Burns passed away in March of 1996, just weeks after celebrating his 100th birthday, his family found both cufflinks resting in a small dish on his nightstand, exactly where Jack Benny had once kept his own for 50 years, waiting to be seen each morning. A small daily reminder passed from one friend to another across a gap of 11 minutes in the dark and 65 years of everything that followed. George's son later said that the family chose to bury him wearing both cufflinks, one from each side of a friendship that had outlasted vaudeville, radio, the entire golden age of television, and finally death itself, reuniting in some small physical way, two objects that had spent 50 years apart on two different nightstands belonging to two men who had never really been apart at all. If this story moved you, think about the things you might be holding on to, waiting for the right moment to finally open them, the conversations you're putting off, the boxes still sealed in some drawer somewhere. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. And before you go, hit that like button if this one got you. It really does help. Then drop a comment and tell me, is there something you've been waiting for the right moment to finally deal with? Just tell us what it is, however small. Let's remember them here together.